So guys, now let's begin with the functions in Python. So in this video, we are gonna cover up about syntax of a Python function. We will see about the function logic, and we will learn how to apply function in real Python programming. So now let's begin with this. First, let's start with the syntax of a function. This is how a function syntax look like, and let me show you in of a real Python code function. So this is a defining state of a function, and this is a calling state of a function. So this is a defining state and this is a calling state of a function. Now let's understand what are the different part of a defining state of a function. So a function always begin in Python with a def keyword, and this def is a reserved keyword in Python. That means we cannot declare a variable name with this def keyword. And once we finish this def keyword, it follows with a function name. Like this hello is a function name over here, and it could be any name, any word we can put it out over here. But only thing is that you need to follow all of the variable name rules over there. If you don't understand those variable name rules, then please go and check my videos about Python variables. So once you get that, you will know what are those variable rules, name rules, I would rather say, because this is a kind of a variable. And once we finish this function name, it follows a parenthesis, then followed by a colon, and then we goes down in the next line, and then with a new indentation, we write down the different instruction of this function. And then in the end of this defining state, we write down a return value. So what this function will give a return value. If in case we don't write this line explicitly or we don't provide any return value to a function explicitly, in that case, function will take none value as its return value. And a function is having a calling state. So in this calling state, we write down the function name like this hello name follows by a parenthesis. So this is how a function is having two state. One is the function defining state and another one is having the function calling state. And now we understand all the different part of a function. Now let's understand the logic behind a function and how does a function object differ from a normal Python object. So to understand that, I want you to go on a specific web page or website called python tutor.com, as this provide a pretty good interface. And now go on this Python tutor, then go ahead in this live programming mode. So this interface is having a visual execution. We can see line by line. It will give you a bit idea about memory of a different objects also. So guys, to understand functions, first let's declare a variable. Let's say a is equal to 16. Now let's define a function. Let's give a function name hello, close parentheses, right colon, go in the next line. So in this function, first let's declare a variable b and give it to a value 12, then print b, then give it a return value b plus 1, then declare one more function. Let's say c is equal to 45. Now let's print a and print our function. And this is where the utility of this pythontutor.com interface comes in picture. That with this interface, we can run this whole code line by line, as well as it gives a memory reference also. So here we have two things. This light green arrow give a reference to that line which has just executed. That color arrow give a reference the line which is about to get executed. So let's start executing this code from the first line. So go in this first. So as the red arrow is there, that means our first line is about to get executed. So now let's execute our first line of the code. Yeah, so first line has executed. So do you see what has happened when our first line has executed? We have created in our memory a value 16, and this variable a is a reference to this memory, and this is a global scope memory, or you could say in a normal term that this is a Python file memory. Now this is a function, and now note it down what will happen when this third line will get executed. Just look at very carefully now. So I'm executing this line. Do you see what has happened now? The moment this third line has executed, the next line which is about to get executed is not the fourth line, but it is the eighth line. So what happens whenever we execute a defining state of a function, we don't execute all the instructions right away, but we store this whole defining state in the Python memory, and this function name will be a reference to that function object. And now let's execute the line number 8. So now we have created a new variable c, which is referring to the value 45. Now let's print a, and look at this, what will happen. As a variable we have in the memory, so when we have a variable which is referring to a value, so we'll get that value back. So we got that value print out, that's the 16, but that's where a difference comes. But whenever you give a print to this function variable hello, which is referring to the function object back, so let's do that. So do you see what has happened? We did not get back our function object, but what did we get back? We got back the memory address where this function object has stored. So let me show you with another visualization like what happens. So this is how a Python memory gets stored. So it segregates into different memory slots, and all these memory slots have a memory address. And whenever we execute a code, or you could say a variable declaration, so what happens, these variables like this a is a variable knows about these memory slots. So whenever we give a reference to these variables, they goes in that memory slot and get back the memory back, if in case that a variable is referring to a normal like integer, string, or other built-in kind of a objects. But when a hello object as this variable hello is referring to a function object, and if we will call it's like this, or you could say print hello, so in that case what will happen, it will give us this memory address back. It will not give us back the hello object. So that's what happened over here. We got back that function hello is at this particular memory address. And if you want to check the memory address of any object, then we have a id function. So let's say id hello, but this id will give a normal number wise id, and this function memory reference is into the hex code. So now let's convert this id code into a hex code. So let's say hex, and yeah. So now you will see that both of these memory address is the exactly same memory address. So now we have seen that if we will utilize this defining state of a function, we don't get back our function object, but we just get back wherever that function object has stored in the Python memory. So let's remove now these codes. Let's remove all of these code. Now let's see what happens now when we utilize a calling state of a function. As we have seen, the function is having two states. One is the defining state and one is the calling state. So let's use this calling state hello. And what is a calling state? When we use a function name or any variable which is referring to this function object, and then we apply a parenthesis after that. So now run this code line by line to understand this in a better way. So first let's reach on this object, this function calling state, and let's execute this line. So do you see, the moment this line has executed, what has happened? You see, a new thing has happened. We have created a new function scope. And what is that new function scope? So let's understand with a new visualization in a better manner. So when we execute this hello, so what happened? So we created a new function scope, or you could say a separate memory scope. So if this line will get executed, so what will happen? This variable b will be created in this function scope. So this variable b will know about this memory slot, which is a new function scope memory slot, and its value is 12. So that's how we will work now when we are in a calling state of a function. A new scope will be created. So now we have this new scope. So now let's execute the line number 4. So do you see, this variable b has created in this function scope, not in the file global scope. Now let's print b. So now whatever it will do, it will go ahead in this function scope and get the value back. And so we got a 12 in the printout. Now let's return b. So what has happened? It gave us the returned value 13, as b value is 12. So 12 plus 1, 13. And let's execute this line and note it down. It's a very important part. Look at this function scope. When we have got our return value back, so that function scope has gone away. So that function scope was a temporary scope. So whenever we call our function, that scope gets created, and after giving a returning value, or like after executing all the instruction and giving a return value, that scope got away or get evaporized. So now you have seen that what happens when we call this function. So all these instructions get executed whenever we use a calling state of a function, not in a defining state. But now let's print this function hello. Let's print this function hello and see what will happen. So let's reach up to this line. Now execute this the same way as we are using a calling state. So whenever a calling state will run, we will always get back to a function object, this real function object, and we will execute all the instructions. So we define this variable b in a new function scope. We print b. So we got this 12 print out. Now we have reached our returning state of a function. So we got our return value. So now, but we are utilizing this returning value with a print function. So we got 13, that return value in the printout, but that return value did not get stored anywhere in our file scope memory. But if in case we want to utilize this return value, so we can assign this calling state to a variable. So let's assign this return value to a variable cf. So now let's run the code and see what will happen now. The same way, if we are using a calling state, so we will always go back to our function and all the instruction will be executed. So we created a new scope immediately, and same way we are executing all the instruction. But this time, now this return value 13 will be assigned to this new variable cf. So now that function, after giving the return value, that function scope has gone, but its returned value 13 now we have stored in this new cf variable, and now we can utilize this return value if we want in future in our code. So let's give a printout to this return value CF. So now if we run this whole code, so let's run the whole code. So we got this return value in our printout. So now we have understood that what happens in the calling state and what happens in the defining state of a function. But now let's see some of the more parts of our defining states, or like, yeah. So now let's do one thing. Let's declare a new variable d, and this variable d, to this variable we will assign this function hello, but not a calling state, but only a defining state. So do you see what has happened now? If we look at in the Python memory, now this function object hello is having two variables. One the hello, which was the function name, and when we have assigned it to a new variable, now this variable d is also a variable which is referring to this function object. So it is just like our hello function variable. So if we will print out this variable d, it will give us back what? So let's run the whole code. Let me go in the line first, and let's run the whole. What is not coming? So let me do one thing. It should come. Yeah, it has come. It took time a bit, but do you see what it has given us? It has given us the memory address of this function object, the way this hello defining state gives us. And we can now use this d to call a function also. So let's do just like, so now we have got this function object memory address, and now when we are using this d in a calling state, so it's just like hello followed by a parenthesis. So we went back to our function and a new function scope has created. The same way all the instructions will be executed now. So now we have understood more about defining state and calling state. Now let's see some of the important parts. So because after executing this state has evaporated, so let's move it back. Now let's understand these important things. So let's understand first about this, what is this function scope and what is this global scope. And we have seen something about these scopes. So let's, instead of this, so let me remove all of these things. Now let's call this function and read to this. So this function scope gets created whenever we call our function, and this scope is a pretty temporary scope. That's what we have already know. Now let's reach up to the return value. So this is the whole function scope, and after giving this returned value, that scope will be gone from the memory. This part we know. But this function scope is having a access or could access the global scope memory if in case we have a requirement. So what do I mean on that? So let's say suppose we are building a program, and there is a let's say some memory which comes from a database and stored in this file object. So we can take that memory from that file object to this function if there is a requirement. So let's say now this a has come from a database in the file memory. So now we can take this value a from the global scope in this variable a. So let's print a and let's run the whole code. Do you see when we are calling this function, after that we have gone over there. So when we are printing this a, so what it did, we got this 16 printout. So this variable first checked, do we have this a in our function scope? If it is not there, then it will go out and look at in the global scope. So as it was there in the global scope, so we got this 16 in the printout. The another thing will happen the same way. That was one of the important things about this function scope and a global scope. But let's say now we have defined this a variable inside in our function also. Now what will happen? Now which variable will get the priority? So let's reach up to this variable a. So now what it does, Python interpreter, it first look at the nearest scope. So in this uh, function scope, this hello scope, this scope is the nearest one. So now we have assigned this value 45. So now when we'll use this variable a reference, so first it will look at in this function scope memory. If it will not find there, then only it will go in the global scope. So we print out this 45, then again we declared a new variable. Now rest other thing will happen in a same way. So now we have understood about this function scope and a global scope. So now let's understand about this thing also in a more better way. Though I have told in the beginning this point also that default return value of a function is none. So what's the implication of that? So let's say now we are not giving any return value to this function. Now what will happen? So now first let's run the code line by line. Reach over there. So do you see that in the end, despite we did not explicitly provide a returned value, still we are getting a none as a returned value. But now we did not utilize or store this value, so that has gone. But now let's declare again a CF variable to this assign this calling state to this CF variable. Now what will happen? So now what value will we get? So the CF variable is having a none value because the CF variable would get the value whatever this calling state function will get in return. And even if you will now, let's say print hello with the calling state, so what will get in the printout? Will we always gets in the printout the returned value. So what will happen? So let me do one thing. Now let's start run the code. So now we are calling this function over here. So we went back. So do you see when we have got the return value? So we got none. Again now when we are assigning, so again we'll call this function and all the instruction will get execute again. So again we got 25. But now when we are assigning this, so we got a none, so we assign the none value. Now we have stored the CF to a none value. So if we'll use anywhere the CF, none value will be used. So now we have understand this particular part also. And function scope is temporary. That part you have, I hope, understood very clearly. Function variable gets preference, that you have already seen that if we have a variable declaration inside the function and the same variable is there in outside global scope, so the nearest scope will always get the preference. So now let's understand C. And yes, and there's one more thing. These global scope do not have that file scope access of these function scope variable. So if in case we will utilize this, want to take this B, want to utilize this B and let's say print B, so what will happen? We'll get an error. See, B, name B is not defined. So first let's do one thing. First let's call this. So we got 12 from here when this function will execute it and 13 as a return value printout. Now let's use this B, but B is not there in the global scope, it's in the function scope, and global scope do not have a access of a function scope. So what will happen? We'll get an error. Name B is not defined. And most of the basic thing we have understood very well by now. So I'm doing one thing. So these are the three things we will learn in a more advanced videos. These three concepts of the function. And in the next video, we will learn about arguments and parameters of a function, and we will see some built-in function, and then we will do some exercise and we will see really how do we utilize function in the real Python programming. I hope by now this video has given a really strong fundamentals of the functions, and try to apply all of these things by yourself many times and over here. So by now I hope you have could easily figure out how did we get these two 12 and 13 value back, and what will happen when we will use this print hello, the defining state of the function will get the memory address wherever this function object has stored. And what will happen if we'll assign this a is equal to hello, so what will get in the printout? Think about that. Pause this video, think. So let's print a. So we got all this back because this is the defining state of a function, right? And if we will print, so if what will happen if a is equal to hello, so now what will happen? Let's run the code. So do you see what has happened? We got this 12 also print out, because whenever we call this function, it always go and execute all these instructions. So print is there, so we got print b. Now if we will now print a, now what will happen? Now what will get in the printout? We'll print out 13, because those instructions has already executed. The returned value was assigned to this variable a, so we got a 13 back. So all these things I hope you have understood very well by now. So thanks guys, and please like this video and subscribe the channel. And let's move towards the next video. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.